Okay, welcome everybody to this session, another webinar in Mindsets. We're very pleased to have you all here with us. I know that you're coming from different places in the world, which is fantastic. And it's great to see you here today. So I'm Dina Marjoukou. I'm a Teaching Excellence Fellow at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, in Scotland. Originally from Greece. I spent more than half of my life here, though. And I am the founder of the Mindsets group, which operates via the global community network, OneHE. Before I introduce you to our great presenter today and the session, the topic we have for you, I would like to give you a brief introduction about this effort we're making here with Mindsets, the group. And what we do here is that we discuss information, digital and media literacy, skills development of students, and our community is free to join. We have so far around 360 members, and the themes we examine are around how we can empower students to develop digital media and information literacy, and we want to engage educators, librarians, learning and teaching support professionals, policymakers, but also students themselves in higher education, as we are exploring these issues from their point of view. And we're very much interested in digital inequalities as well, and all those different socioeconomic differences and difficulties students may encounter in their educational journeys. And if you haven't looked at the global network OneHE, you may want to look at that because it has some interesting micro-learning approaches on a number of different themes. But this particular open community concentrates on empowering us as we discuss issues that concern our students. And also we want to invite you to share any resources you may have, any projects you may be developing. And in our communities, we are organizing and giving you a number of different projects around the world. So one of the things that we do, and we also organize webinars like this one. So with this short introduction, I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenter today, Professor Steve Joordens. Steve is a professor of psychology and director of the ALT. Is it ALT, Steve? Is it right? Or should I say ALT lab?
So it's the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab.
Yes, okay.
Back when ALT used to be cool.
Okay, excellent. Advanced Learning Technologies Lab at University of Toronto, Scarborough. And also Steve is in the advisory board of OneHE, the global organization that I mentioned just earlier. Today, the title of the talk is a very interesting title, Teaching a Growth Mindset, Deepening Concept Knowledge and Exercising Transversal Skills, the amazing potential of formative peer and self-assessment. I don't know how many of you have actually been engaged before in formative peer and self-assessment. I have to be honest that I haven't really included that in my teaching, but I've seen other institutions having that as a very important element of their learning and teaching approaches. So I'm very interested to find out more about that, about the pedagogical power, the ability to develop a growth mindset in students, and really focus on this, all of these characteristics we talk about in terms of the whole person, education, critical mindset, creative thinking, communication, working collaboratively, teamwork, and all of these really important skills that we want our students to develop. So I believe, Steve, you have something about the technological solution you have prepared as well. So we're very, very interested to hear from you. And with that, I hope, comprehensive introduction to, I think, your very interested talk. I will just pass on to you now to tell us more about peer assessment.
Sure, 100%. Now, one thing really quickly, I just noticed something in the chat came just to me from someone who said, I cannot seem to hear anything, but I assume the rest of you can hear perfectly fine, other than this one person named Cher.
Right, it may be something, in their settings. I'll get in touch as you are presenting, Steve. I'll try to sort it out. Thank you very much for this.
That's cool. I just needed one thumbs up to know things are good. Okay, cool.
Yeah, you can all hear fine.
Yeah, so thank you, Dina, very much for inviting me to talk today. I'm really looking forward to it. What I really want to ultimately do is to show you guys what I put students through in hopes to help them sort of develop this growth mindset. It's always tricky to even attach with the term growth mindset, but I will. I also want to mention, I noticed in the sign-in that at least one of my students, I invited my students to come here if they would like. At least one of my students is here. I think it was Kinsey was here. She's probably been through this. She will be in my course now, but probably has been in other courses as well. So if you have any questions and you'd like a student perspective, feel free to ask, well, what do students think about that? And maybe she'll chime in. I'll also mention that while I'm going to sort of be presenting, I've got the chat window open here. I'm going to kind of keep an eye on it as we go. If this turns into more discussion than presentation, I'm perfectly cool with that. I will take the floor until somebody takes it from me, but feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and I will try to jump from it as well. Okay, so let me jump in here. So this notion of the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. It's a really cool notion, and of course Carol Dweck put it out a number of years ago, and it caught on very quickly. And in fact, maybe that's sort of part of the problem, we could describe it that way, is that it really did catch on really quickly before there was a lot of data or research behind it. And because of that, it's become more of a controversial notion. But let's just sort of start here with the idea. So the idea is that students could come into a learning situation either with what is called the fixed mindset or the growth mindset. And a fixed mindset is the kind of mindset that says, you know, I can do certain things, I can't do other sorts of things. There are boundaries to what I'm able to learn, boundaries to what I'm able to grow into. And so kind of this is who I am. Whereas the growth mindset is as implied, much more growth looking. So someone with a growth mindset views challenges as opportunities. Acknowledge and embrace your weaknesses. I'm going to stress this one. I'm going to come back to this one in a moment to say, well, that's really naive, but I'll come back. Learn to give and receive constructive criticism. Intelligence and talent is dynamic and ever improving. So the idea is this is the optimal kind of mindset for learning. Right? To go into every learning situation being ready to see weaknesses, ready to see them as opportunities for growth, embracing them, using them to grow. It's a beautiful idea. I think it's right, but I think at its core, it's naive. And in fact, it's partly naive, perhaps, not just because of some of these things, acknowledge and embrace your weaknesses that I'll come back to, but also because the recommended approach to supporting a growth mindset is, in my opinion, too weak. So the recommended approach is often one that involves words and context. And so the idea is, you know, to teach students to kind of think of things this way. I can't do this yet. And I'm on the right track, and mistakes help me improve. So if we get our students thinking this way, and how do we get them thinking this way? Well, we live it and breathe it. We talk this way. You know, we speak to them as though we're assuming they have a growth mindset and they can grow and get better at everything. And the whole context of learning, and right down to the textbooks we use and the assignments we give, should all be infused with this sort of growth words, you know, this feeling of growth stuff. And what I'm going to argue is words are not enough. And I'm also going to argue, if I go back for a second here, sorry, that it's because of this, I'm going to argue there is a villain in the growth mindset story that is often not talked about enough. So I see someone say, I'm wondering the role that the tutor and fellow students have in supporting a growth mindset. Let's hold on to that for a second, because that's going to be a big part in to where I'm going to go with this. So yeah, so I want to argue that there's a villain, that we do not embrace weaknesses in a natural way. This is not a natural thing for us to do. The growth mindset is not our natural approach to criticism. I'm going to argue a fight or flee response is our natural response to criticism. And that's why I argue that when people have now done a lot more of the research, this is where we've ended up. Debate arises over teaching growth mindsets to motivate students. So to kind of grab this debate in a nutshell, It kind of goes like this. Originally, there was a little bit of data to support Dweck's idea, but a lot of it was anecdotal. A lot of it was things like, hey, Michael Jordan has a growth mindset. He's always had a growth mindset from a child, and look what he was able to do. And so there were a number of these sort of anecdotes of highly successful people who had a growth mindset. That's where a lot of the concept came from. There was also a little bit of empirical data suggesting it would work. And then the idea took off. Okay, just went big fast. And a lot of people then started trying to replicate those studies, and they couldn't in some cases. Now, what this particular one, and if you go to this URL, I'll share all the slides, you can get to the specific story. What it ultimately describes is a large-scale study done by Dweck and others that does show that you can have an effect. It's not a huge effect, but you can have a positive effect by using words in the right way to motivate students. So the suggestion is, no, it's real, but it's small. I still think it's small because we're underestimating the villain. We have to take the villain seriously, and we have to take it on directly. So what do I mean by a villain? This is the fight or flight response. Anytime we feel under threat, and this is going to be a very general sense of the word threat, as I'll come back to in a moment. But anytime we feel threat, we have an amygdala here, and amygdala is like our spider sense, like Spider-Man has. It tingles, right, when there's threat. And it kicks our body into this preparation to either fight the threat dead on or to flee it. And so it changes our whole physiology right down to things like dilations of pupils, your mouth dries, your breathing gets faster, your heart starts to pound. Why is this stuff happening? What it's doing is it's pumping oxygen-rich blood to your body, to your muscles, and it's making them super strong. You know those stories, woman lifts car to save trapped baby. She can do that because her fight or flee is kicked in, and she's got extra strength in her muscles. And that's the idea of the fight or flee. It makes us really prepared. Psychological safety pins spring to mind. Okay. But it makes us really prepared. Now, the idea of this, right, was like a bear steps out from a bush when we're gathering berries. That's when this system evolved. And the idea is the moment you see that bear, that second, we want you to go into the super strong mode where you can decide, I'm either going to attack that bear or I'm going to get the heck out of here. But either way, I need this super strength to get me through this. And that's the idea of this mechanism. It gets us into this hyper strong mode to help us survive an acute threat. Now, here's the critical point. There's bears, and bears trigger it. But this is a very sensitive mechanism. It's kept us alive by being super sensitive to threat. And in the modern world, that includes social threats as well. So let me just give you an example to think about. Imagine you were going to a very important event for your career. Maybe you were going to win a prize or be acknowledged in some way. And so it was very important to you. And your significant other, your partner's coming with you to the event. And as you see your partner coming down the stairs, you're thinking, they're not dressed appropriately. The way they're dressed doesn't fit this event. What do you do? First question, do you say anything? Do you just bite your tongue and go, whatever? Or if you do choose to say something, you probably are very careful with your words. You're probably thinking, how do I say this? How can I suggest this in a way that what? We say things like that won't hurt that person's feelings, but it's not really hurting that person's feelings. It's like if you say, maybe you want to wear something else, you're saying you shouldn't be wearing what you're wearing right now. And that is seen as a criticism by that person. And that person will generally react with either fight or flight. They'll either say to you, too bad, this is what I'm wearing. I want to wear this and you can't tell me what to wear. That's the fight response. Or they'll say, you know what? I don't want to go to your thing anyway. Okay, fine. I'm just going to stay here. That's the flight response. Either way, we didn't want to put that person in that situation, right? But this is the natural response to criticism. So when we talk about giving our students constructive feedback, And we have this notion that they're just going to accept it with open arms. Thank you for pointing out my flaws. We are being naive. That is not going to be their natural reaction. In fact, by the way, I should have included this data, but there's research showing that over 50% of students don't even read the feedback that comes back with their work. They flee it at the point of not even engaging with it. And so this is a natural response to feedback. And if we want to teach a growth mindset, we have to admit the villain is there. And then we have to think about the best way of helping a student around it, which will kind of get us now towards Ian's notion here, which I'll get to in just a moment. But just to make this clear, what we want to do is we want to find a way so that when we're giving that feedback, rather than fight or flight, we inspire them to sit, think, and learn. And it's not natural. But the good news is there's a lot of things we do in life that are not natural. Playing guitar is not natural, but people who put in the time and effort and practice can become very good at it. Similar for dancing, speaking multiple languages, whatever you want. I just saw a question. Let me see. How do we know when, for example, a student reacts negatively to feedback suggesting they need to completely redraft their essay, that the reaction is flight or fright and not disappointment or depression or some other negative emotion? Well, I mean, I think this is the bigger point, right? The growth mindset suggests happiness, that we're all going to be happy when we have potential growth opportunities pointed out to us. Here's how you could be better. And I think even the examples that you're pointing out are reflections of the fight or flight. So let me connect fight or flight with emotion really quickly. Virtually all of our emotions begin with this fight or flight system being kicked in some way. And then what our brain does is it considers the context in which that happens, and that original energy of the fight or flight turns into an emotion like depression or sadness or disappointment. And so when that person's stirred up and they realize they're stirred up because you didn't like their work, now that original fight or flight, which is the immediate reaction, could become depression or sadness or disappointment or something like that. But if it's negative, it's coming from the fight or flight. And so that is the sort of impetus of it. There is also this freeze state, as Charles mentions. Every now and then people they're not sure whether to fight or flee, given the situation. It depends how strong is that thing. Can I take it on? Can I defeat it? And so sometimes they do freeze for a while. They'll be in this freeze state, and then the freeze will resolve to either fight or flight, typically. Okay, so if we have this, and now we can get into this core question. Okay, how do we help students get around this villain? We can't just ignore it. Words are not enough. So a couple of things just before I kind of watch you there. Yeah, rabbit in the headlights, same idea. Which way do I go? Yeah, exactly. So let me make this distinction clear. The distinction between information learning and skill learning, because I think we all really need to understand this. And I started life as a cognitive psychologist before becoming just a, pedagogical geek kind of guy. So from cognitive psychology, we know there's multiple memory systems and that they work differently. So for example, if you want to learn a lot about guitar playing, you want information about guitar playing, maybe different styles of guitar playing, different approaches to it, different guitars and the sounds they make. You can learn a lot about guitar playing in a good 1 hour session. If you have a good presenter with a good structured presentation, you can come out of that 1 hour having learned a whole bunch of information. But if you want to learn to play the guitar, you're not going to learn it in an hour, and you're not going to learn it by sitting and listening to somebody. You're not going to learn it in a passive way. The only way you're going to learn it is to play it. And you're going to play it poorly initially, but with enough repeated structured practice in the right context, a supportive context, and Ian, you're still in the back of my mind, I will get there, then these skills can develop and they can become very powerful, right? Jimi Hendrix looks like he was born playing guitar. It seems that second nature to him. And the claim is this is what we want to do with our students. Yes, we want to teach them information. So in my case, I want to teach them all about psychology, but we also want to give them good exercise with these skills, any skills that we think are important. And we're going to have to do that differently. We're going to have to ask them to use the skills in a repeated, structured way in order for them to develop. And if a growth mindset is one of those skills, then we're going to have to put them in context where they get to use that skill, and we need to support it. So I want to talk about, I'm about to jump into just showing you what I do. Rather than talking at you, I'm going to give you an example of the process that I regularly put students through. It's embedded in a technology called Peer Scholar that we created in my lab. It uses what we call formative peer and self-assessment. But what you're going to see is we leverage a lot of pedagogical processes here. Peer and self-assessment, certainly. That's going to let us bring in the repetition we need. And it's also going to give us a context for critical thought, creative thought, and communication that students like. So it's going to give us an opportunity for them to practice these skills in a way that they value. We're going to use a lot of micro-learning all through this. And not just micro-learning, but I'm now a very big fan of teach students something in a short period of time and then immediately ask them to use it. We don't have a name for this yet, or at least I don't know a name unless any of you guys do, but the learn and then practice, like this immediate learn and then immediately put it into practice. I'm a big fan of that for getting the learning from an information state to, I say it goes from the brain to the body. You actually embody that learning when you have them use it. So you'll see a lot of that, and you're going to see a lot of formative assessment going on. The idea that if we want students to grow, we'd better have an activity where they can improve something, right? Which is the sort of formative assessment idea. We're giving them assessments, we're giving them feedback to help them reform their work. And so the feedback is there to help them create a better version of their work. That's what we mean by formative. And that's critical. If you want them to practice growing, you have to give them the opportunity to grow. Okay. The last thing I want to mention before I jump into the actual process, and this is finally getting to your point, Ian, Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development. I'm a huge fan of this notion. The idea, for those of you who don't yet know this well, is you can imagine these different zones. And right now, a student comes to your classroom knowing certain things. There's certain things they're good at and they know how to do. There's a lot of things we would like them to be good at, but they don't know how to do. And that's what we want to teach them, right? We want to bring them to some greater area. But the notion is we can overshoot. So let me say this way. If I was a new guitar player, a young guitar player, and I wanted to learn how to play guitar, if somebody's told me, watch Jimi Hendrix, see what he does, now try to do what he does. Well, I'm probably in here somewhere, and Jimi Hendrix's skill level is probably over here somewhere, just way, 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 way beyond me. And if I see that and try to do that, I'm just going to get demoralized, right? I'm just going to say, talk about a fixed mindset. There's no way I can do what he's doing as fast as he's doing it, as accurately as he's doing it. If that's what you expect me to do, I can't do it, right? Rather, what a good educator or a good process does is it takes students as far as they can go beyond what they currently do. How far can they go with enough support and guidance? And that's what we want to focus our learning. We want to get them that next little area within the zone of what they can handle with a lot of support. Now, when Vygotsky wrote this, he spoke more like Ian did in the previous one, support from people. That's what he imagined the teacher's role was critical in, is supporting the student in getting beyond their current learning. I'm a scale guy. My current class, not my current class, in the summer, it's a small 200 student class, 250 student class. In the fall, that class is 1,600 students. I like to say, well, can we do this with students? But can we do it 1,600 or more at a time? And so now it won't be the instructor so much that's giving the guidance and the support and the structure. It will be technology. So the story I'm about to show you is how we bring all of this together into a learning process supported by technology to really give students, in my opinion, the optimal opportunity to develop a growth mindset. Okay. So I've been watching questions a little bit. Yeah, and we have a hashtag there if anybody wants to tweet stuff. That's kind of cool. So I'm going to leave this, sneak over here, make that full screen. Oh, I've just lost the chat window when I did that. Let me see if I can get the chat window back. Okay, good. Good. Okay, so I'm just going to log in. Don't worry about any of this stuff. I'm just going to log into a course in a standalone, and I'm just going to walk you through a process. And normally this process would have students going through 3 steps, sort of one after the next. I've got them just so I can get into them in a weird way, but don't worry about anything here. Let's just get into what we see. And I want you to imagine you're a student now coming in, and this was an activity I did a while ago, but I want to give you the sense of this dance between micro-learning and peer and self-assessment and formative feedback and how it all kind of comes together. So here's one example. They come into the activity and I say, hey, here's the context of your activity. So I have a little video in here, and the context is just helping a local flight school who feels like their students aren't very engaged in their lectures. So I want you to learn about engagement and some of the evidence base behind it. And because your task is to give a pitch to this flight school about something they could do that would make their lectures more engaging. So let's say that's the task I gave my students, but here's the first bit of micro learning. I'm asking them to submit a pitch. Okay, well, what are the characteristics of an effective pitch? What does a good pitch look like? And so right within the instructions, I am now going to walk them through, and I can kind of show you what I'm walking them through here because it's all aligned with this rubric. So if we fire open this rubric, I'm just going to open it directly in a separate window here. You see, this is a rubric that suggests that there's 4 core components of a good pitch. And again, it kind of lists, what those are. And this is exactly what I'm going through in that video. So I'm starting by talking about organization and content, and I basically just go through that. And I know you guys can't hear these when I do it, which is probably just as well, but you can get the sense that the students would play these right within the...
Okay, so you have to create...
So the students would be able to play these right within the instructions. They would hear it. They're saying, okay, that's what a pitch is. I know it. I've seen the rubric, and now off I go. So I'm in this spot. Here's my pitch. And yeah, they can just basically create their pitch. And not a lot sort of relevant here, but I will give you a sense that one of the nice things, I'm just going to go to YouTube for a second. Always dangerous to go to your homepage at YouTube because people get to learn too much about you. Like, hey, sure. Let's do this one. So let's say I'm just going here just to make a point. So let's say this was a video I created. Maybe my pitch, I wanted to pitch as a video and not as a written piece. Well, within this, because it's a digital platform, you can just as easily input something that's digital. So for example, with a camera, you could just put the URL in there, and now you have that embedded directly within. So this is just a multimedia workspace, okay? And imagine students just do whatever they want to do, create their pitch, save it. Okay, that's cool. Now, let me get to the first part of what I consider the optimal process for them learning how to learn from feedback. The first critical step is having them learn to give feedback. Do not put them on the receiving side before they've had a good taste of the giving side. So I like to say for when it comes to learning from feedback, it's better to give than receive, in my opinion. So what this assess step is going to be about is teaching them about how to give feedback. And in part of that is going to be teaching them about the villain, because the villain is so key, and they need to understand that. And so here I'm going to have them, and I'll show you this in just a moment, but their core task here is, look at this, in this phase, you get to be the teacher. So we're going to have you do what we usually do. That is, you're going to look at some of the work that your peers have submitted. And we are going to ask you to give each of these peers some feedback, something they're doing good, something they could do better. So we'll get there. I'll talk that through. But again, before we do this, before we have them start to give feedback to one another, we have to do some micro learning to get them up to speed, to get them comfortable with that. And I like to do a couple of different things in my micro learning. The first part you see here is more motivational. I like to start with motivational. Why should you care about the skill of giving feedback? What's in it for you to take the time to learn how to give feedback well? And there is a lot in it for the student, right? If the student is going to go on to a management position or anything like that, then being able to give feedback well to the people working with them is a very, very powerful skill. So we talk about, why this is a powerful skill that's very valued within the workforce. And so therefore it's worth your time to kind of dig into this and think about it well. Okay, so that's fine. I now feel motivated. Okay, now I want to do two things with students now that they're motivated. First, I want to describe the villain, and this is the villain. Why is it so challenging to give constructive feedback? So just like I talked to you about that example of your significant other coming to an event with you, I talk about scenarios where they realize it's uncomfortable to give somebody feedback.
Okay, I've switched the automatic doors off, so push it on the left.
Okay, we have an open mic somewhere. If someone doesn't mind checking. All right, so the host unmuted everyone, including me, but I think I'm back. I assume someone will talk if I'm not, or someone will post something.
Yes, you're back. Sorry about that. That was completely my fault. I was like a rabbit in headlights, the fight or flight situation.
You felt that, huh?
Yes.
It's the beginning of anxiety. Yeah, absolutely. All cool. Yeah, so I just described to them the villain, right? Just like you guys know, the fight or flight. Now, why do I describe to them the villain? Well, for two reasons. But A is just so they understand. That's the critical thing. You can't manage anything you don't understand. But the second part is we're ultimately going to get to the important video, some would say, which is, okay, what are the characteristics of effective constructive feedback? And I end up listing 6 characteristics here, and I'll show you those characteristics in just a moment. I'll show you the rubric that's connected with them. But this is where I list the 6. And the nice thing is, when you do it this way, there's a reason for them. And let me give you one taste. Let me give you my favorite one of these 6. My favorite one of these 6 says, when you're providing constructive feedback to this person, rather than talking about their draft and everything that was wrong with it, they're going to get a chance to revise. Let me be clear about that. Once they get the feedback, they'll get a chance to revise their work. So rather than saying, here's what I didn't like about your draft, it didn't have this, it didn't have this, it didn't have this, it's hard for the person to change anything about their draft, right? It is what it is. It's what they submitted. But if instead you take what's called a feed forward approach, instead of a feedback, you take a feed forward approach. And what we mean by that is you say, okay, that was a really cool and interesting draft. Now, here are some things I think you could add or change that would make your revision even better. So we're looking forward to your revision, and we're giving you advice about how to go from what you have to something even better. And here are the things that'll make it even better. Just wording it that way calms the villain, right? I'm not attacking you. I'm helping you. I'm helping you to produce an even better product. And in fact, almost every one of these 6, when you think about the villain, you understand that the fine dance of giving good feedback is all about not poking the villain. It's about getting the information across in a way that won't get the fight or flee kicked in. And once you understand that, it makes sense why you would do it these ways. So I like all of that. I've taken them on a little bit of an information journey now. And then, of course, my favorite thing is you've just learned about it. Now go and do it. And so just to give you a sense here, this is where technology comes in handy. There's nothing magical about technology and ed tech. Technology just does logistics really well. And so in this case, for example, I can show this peer I can show the student the work of 4 different peers, randomly selected from the class, presented anonymously, so they don't know whose work this is. And I can now say, okay, I want you to assess each one. And of course, it has to pick these peers, and then it eventually has to keep the assessments and send it back to those peers. And so there's all this information flowing back and forth. That's what technology is good at. That means we don't have to worry about it. What this allows me to do is build in repetition, which is what I think is critical for skill development. So let me just walk you through really quickly a taste of one of these. What are your thoughts about giving your 6 rather than co-creating our 6? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the 6 there. But I'll come back to that, Ian. I'm not quite sure what you're alluding to. Maybe you could be a little more clear about what you're alluding to there. Okay, so imagine I was going through this peer's work. Just to give you a taste, one of the things you can do, of course, is put comments directly on the work. So if you want to annotate the work directly and connect something for the student to see, you can do that. But then over here, this is another sort of component of what I call it formal structured learning. When we have a 20 student class and we hope everybody will chime in with their thoughts and ideas, but 3 people talk and 17 people shut up, this is going to make everybody talk. Everybody has to go through here and present ideas and thoughts and assessments. And so one of the things I like to do, remember that pitch rubric that I showed you? We still have it over here. Right? This was the quality of a good pitch. Well, if we just taught them, these are the qualities of a good pitch, they now use this rubric to help when they made their pitch. Now what are they doing? Now they're looking at their peers' pitches and applying that rubric. And so they're using the rubric sort of a different way, and they're learning very richly what a good pitch is, right? Because they're saying, wow, this person had great organization. Oh, but their visuals aren't very good, I don't think. And so we're helping the student learn what different good pitches are by allowing them to see, first of all, multiple pitches. We're also going to ask them to give feedback. And you have a lot of control over what you ask them. I'm just giving you my sort of default way. So I want to take a moment here for the positive feedback, because we get so hung up on the growth mindset that I think we sometimes miss something almost as powerful. So let me tell you this story. I was shooting some videos for Canadian Management Association, weird thing about giving feedback. Same sort of story I'm sort of telling you. But we're at the end of one day of shooting, and we were going to resume the next day. And there was about 4 people in the room. And I said to those 4, what would be really cool? If you guys could all go home and think about some time when somebody gave you constructive feedback and you thought about it and you used it to change your behavior and it ended up being a positive in your life. I would love to film a few of these little stories of people giving examples of how this, was a good thing for them to do. I came back the next day and I said, okay, you guys all set? And they were like, no, we don't have examples. And I'm like, what? But one of them bravely said, however, I do have an example of when somebody said something really good to me that changed my life. Somebody who saw my work in a way I didn't see it and said, hey, do you realize you have this skill or ability? You should maybe follow that up a little bit more. And other people said, yeah, I can remember situations like that too. So here's my core point. You know how we all think people will hold their arms out for this constructive feedback and embrace it? They don't do that for constructive feedback. We'll teach them how. But for positive feedback, they do it naturally. We all just embrace positive feedback. So teaching our students how to give good positive feedback as well, how to highlight something that student is doing well and say, hey, you should continue to do that, should be part of all of the feedback we do. It should be, a core part, because that's probably as more naturally powerful than constructive feedback is. However, of course, the problem is we're already highlighting something the person is doing well. So if we want them to grow, we have to highlight something they're not doing so well. And so this is the constructive feedback. And I'm going to talk about this for just a second to get you to realize the depth of what's going on here. But if we start by saying just this, okay, if this student was going to change one thing about their work, what should they change to maximally improve it? And how should they go about changing it? Please remember everything you learned about giving constructive feedback when you write this. Let's think about some of those skills, those transversal skills we want students to learn. And let's think about what happens when a student has to answer this question. I'm going to use my geeky transversal skill talk now. They must first engage receptive communication. That is, they need to look at what this person is saying. They need to read it very carefully and go through it. They're looking for weaknesses, right? And that requires critical thought. So as they're doing receptive communication, they're combining that with critical thought to try to find places where this could be stronger. Let's say when they're done, they've identified 3 or 4 spots where it could be stronger. Well, I've asked them for just one thing, focus on one thing. So now they have to use more critical thinking, kind of comparing those weaknesses and figuring out which one most needs fixing. Okay, they got that. Now they need to give this person some advice. Specifically, how can they make it better? Well, that's creative thinking, right? So they have to engage creative thinking to think, okay, what am I going to recommend that this person do to fix this weakness? Once they've figured that out, now they're going to use expressive communication to express that idea to the student. Again, hopefully with a lot of sensitivity about the villain, because we've taught them about the villain. So they're also learning a little bit of emotional intelligence, right? You know, how to communicate in a sensitive way for the receiver. And so all of these skills they're engaging when they answer this question. And when I say I love that there's multiple peers, that's because they'll do all that for peer 1's work. They'll do it again for peer 2. They'll do it again for peer 3. They'll do it again for peer 4. So they're getting the repeated structured practice with critical thinking, creative thinking, communication that they need to develop these skills. Okay. And there's something else they're getting powerfully here too, and that's metacognitive, a big metacognitive hit. And we're gonna put a cherry on that a little bit. When you go through and assess the work of your peers, I've told you a few times, students value this. This is a lot of work. It takes a lot of work for students, but they value it. What they value is they like to see the work of their peers. They find it's just really helpful to see what other people did with this activity. So, and they also always say that gave them a much better sense of their own work and the quality of their own work. It's like this. It's one thing for us to tell a student, you're a B student. It's something else for them to look at the work of their peers and say, I'm a B student. Now they've embraced it. And not only that, they've seen exemplars of people that are potentially better than them. So they could potentially grow. And we just put a bow on this by doing the following. After they've assessed 4 of their peers, or how many ever you want, that's completely adjustable, then they get their own work. And so now we add a self-assessment part here, where they see their own work and we can ask them questions about their own work, including, for example, how did it rank compared to the ones that you saw? So we can do stuff to kind of emphasize that metacognitive piece. So notice that in this one thing, at one level, what they're learning is to give feedback and why it's so challenging. At another level, they're engaging all these skills in very powerful ways. Okay, so I'm going to go to the third step really quickly, but I just want to take a look at, unfortunately I need to dive off. Ian's taken off on us. Okay, great. It's recorded, so hopefully you'll get a look at that. We've assigned for first year where the students did create the rubric by which, co-creating rubrics. I think that's a really great idea when you're using peer assessment of creating the rubric with the student ahead of time. So yeah, 100%. Let me just give you the end of this story and then we can break down into conversation and such. But just to give you the rest of the story. So imagine students have now given feedback. They've learned about the villain. They've had experience trying to be very careful not to offend other people as they've given them feedback. And I think now they are ready to grow from feedback. Okay, they now have a sort of backing that makes them ready, but we still need to support it. So in this phase, when they go in, as it'll tell them right from the beginning, this phase is all about helping you learn from a feedback applied to your work. This will all be familiar to you now. I don't need to show you a whole lot other than to say, we scaffold this, right? So this is my Vygotsky sneaking in there, right? So I'm not there in person, but I'm kind of there. Again, motivational thing. Why should you care about learning? How to learn from feedback? And there's a powerful point to be made there. How do you actually analyze your feedback? What's a good way to do that? And you're going to see we're going to structure that even more as we go in. But I talk to them about analyzing feedback. And then finally, once you've analyzed the feedback and you've got a chance to revise your work, what should you be thinking about doing that? How should you kind of guide your revision of the work? So I talked to them about that. They're again going into this now with this information fresh in their mind. And now what they do is they see, in this case, this is my work over here, and this is what Peer 1 thought. This is the scores that Peer 1 gave to my work on the rubric. If I go down a little further, here's the positive thing that the person said. But here is their critical bit of feedback, bit of constructive feedback here. Remember I told you students, 50% of them don't even read a lot of this stuff if given the choice. I don't give them the choice. So for every bit of feedback, they have to answer some questions. And those questions include ones relating to the villain, the emotionality. Did you feel that emotionality? Right? You probably did, right? You felt that negative emotion. That's normal. That's part of the process. But then look at this. Putting that emotion aside, what was the core piece of advice this peer was trying to express? So we're trying to teach them, and I asked them to reword it in their own words, trying to teach them to get to the point that this person was trying to make. And put the tone to the side if you can. And also, by the way, now that they kind of have emphasized the real point, here is the 6 points that were in that feedback. Whoops, sorry, I scrolled a little more there. The 6 different characteristics of quality feedback. And so we actually get them to rate the feedback they received. Why do we do this? Because they gave feedback to 4 people. And eventually they're going to see what those 4 people thought of their feedback. So we're really teaching them how to give feedback, both by instructing them at the front end and then by having a rubric on the other end where they can see how their feedback was received. And so we can, over activity, we can strengthen their ability to give quality feedback while we are, really getting them to engage with the feedback and understand it. And so they would do that. Again, using critical thinking, creative thinking. I haven't highlighted all that, but they would do that for each peer's work, rating the feedback from each peer, and then ultimately, and this is the formative step, ultimately then be given the option to revise their work. And so they are told at this point, you had 4 peers give you recommendations about how your work could be better. They don't all know what they're talking about. Some are really smart, some not. But you've analyzed the feedback. That feedback that you think was useful, go ahead and change your work. Make your work better. The professor will grade your revised work. And so this is where the growth mindset comes in. And I actually mentioned there's 2 things students highlight about this process they like. The first one I said was being able to see the work of their peers. They like to see the work of their peers. The second is when they get to this point, when they've revised their work, and they look at it and it seems better to them, then it was all worth it. They're going to get a better grade on this piece of work because of what they went through and learning. And that's the reward for growth, right? So the big story that you get from this, I hope, I don't even know if I have the last slide in my slides here, but the big, yeah. I got the chat in front. I've got everything in front. Yeah. Okay. So let's just quickly go back to this. Ultimately, we want to help students as they're learning from feedback, but notice they're also exercising all of these other skills, which we want to build up. So that's a really powerful, structured approach to doing it. Okay, so I kind of hit you with a lot there, but I think that gives you the idea. I wanted to give you the feel of an actual student going through the process. So I hope I didn't go too long, but I'm happy to answer questions as long as anybody has any. Thank you.
Not at all, Steve. Thank you very much. I found it really, really innovative, especially from the point of view of actually assessing the assessment. So I found that particular layer was very beneficial. I would like to open the floor for questions. I don't know if anyone would like to use the microphone, or please use the chat box. But as we're waiting for that, I wanted to ask you a question that I have in my mind for some time now, and I wanted to ask you. I've been thinking of this work in terms of developing digital literacy students generally, and I was thinking that would work really well if, say, a student had maybe more advanced digital literacies than another one, maybe using a specific technology or a tool that they have they used before as part of the previous work, for example, or education. And I feel like if they were in this position to feel more knowledgeable about the particular skills that the other students would like to develop, and perhaps they will have more confidence as well. How do you view this? I mean, could this be used maybe in a different way, as a way of scaffolding the students, but in a peer support way, so that the students who assess the other students maybe are in a position of more knowledge than the other students?
Yep.
Rather than just being equal? Because I think what matters here is the level of knowledge that they've got around the thing that they're assessing, the knowledge they're assessing, and sometimes students may struggle with that.
Yeah. So absolutely. So I kind of walked you through a pre-populated activity that I create that sort of mimics what I do. But with a lot of these technologies, not, mine's Pure Scholar, but there's a lot of these technologies out there, just to be clear. It's a big space now, and they're all pretty flexible. So certainly with Pure Scholar, I can't speak for all of them, but with Pure Scholar, there's a way to set up what we call the mentor-mentee approach, where you have mentees submitting the original work, mentors being the ones coming in on the assess phase, and literally, and in that case, yes, you're right. It's often, yes, it's feedback, but sometimes it's more often advice, or resources, or things like, okay, that was really cool. Here's some things you could check out that, maybe could take your game to the next level, or whatnot. And so, yeah, absolutely, it can work that way. We can also do group work, by the way, in a lot of these things. So to give you a taste, the group work is really cool because sometimes they have to give feedback as a group. And so I'm giving feedback to Dina's group, but our whole group is. And so we have to decide among the four of us, what do we want to say to her? And so when you do the group work stuff, you get the offline, people sitting around a room going, what feedback do we want to give? And that's when they get a lot of the collaborative stuff going on as well.
Absolutely.
So
That's very interesting. Absolutely. And I was thinking that beyond even the skills that you've mentioned already, the students definitely develop confidence and also an appreciation of how difficult it is to provide good feedback, balanced feedback, that we as educators, actually, a lot of the times we struggle to give obviously a balance of positive and how to improve negative aspects as well. So I think you started this presentation saying that sometimes students don't even read their feedback, and I think that if they go through the process of providing feedback themselves, that is definitely a growth mindset, as you say, from point of view of appreciating their own feedback and the time and effort that goes into that.
Yeah, that's one of the, I like to often argue, I have a OneHE course that kind of aligns a little bit with what I talked about here. And that's what I argue, that before we put them in that situation of trying to respond to feedback, because it's so quick to think that person giving you the feedback is a jerk, right? If any of us have done articles, right, where we submitted to a journal, we get the reviews back, and all the reviewers are like jerks and idiots on the first day. When we read it, it's like, did they even read my paper? What are they thinking about? And then we walk away and we come back and they're not quite so, it's like they got more intelligent since we walked away from them. And then eventually we take their information and we put it into our revision. And just like the students, we look at it and we go, oh, that's better. Those people made my work better. But we start with this demonic, like, oh, we want to just, everyone that gives us feedback, we want to say they're jerks. But if we've had to do that, if we've been the reviewer of papers in the scientific process, then we understand the reviewer's mentality a little bit better. And we understand what they are trying to help us make our work better. And living that role first, I think, is a really good thing before we put them in that second role of learning. And normally we don't, right? Normally they just get feedback. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to put them in that step.
Yes,
And I did now understand with Ian saying with respect to the 6 characteristics of feedback. I mean, I picked that because that's what the evidence suggests that those are the optimal ways of instructing people. But there's a lot of flexibility in a lot of this stuff. And if you do want to co-create things with students, if you want to start by saying this is really powerful, do you prefer feedback that's like this or that? You can sometimes, by the way, very sneakily get students to co-create an existing rubric. The rubric can already exist. You cannot tell them about it. And you can just give them this process of, is this an important component or not? And then they talk it through and then they end up with the 6 components, which are the 6 components, but they feel like they created those. And then they are more willing to embrace them and use them. So I like co-creation a lot. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we have a question as well from Lucinda, Steve.
Okay, there we go. Lucinda, Steve, this is really helpful. Thank you. Any tips for balancing this approach with an incredible content-heavy module? Yeah, the old issue of the time. So this is an old issue. So I want to be clear. Let me do this in a few levels. So first of all, we all talk about active learning like it glows. Anytime something's active learning, it's beautiful. It's not always to the student, right? Things that we call active learning, they sometimes call work. And if they aren't buying in, if they're not seeing the value, then it's not having the impact we want it to have. Peer Scholar is certainly active learning. The stuff they went through there is certainly active learning. It certainly work, and it certainly takes time. They like it. They embrace it. They value it. And so that's what makes it gold. But you're absolutely right. We need to acknowledge that the amount of time. So let me just tell you this story really quickly. When I started teaching intro psych at UT Scarborough, we're U of T. It's like U of T pounds our chest. We are the powerful school of Canada or whatever. Every student must learn from the densest textbook with the fewest pictures in it and blah, blah, blah. And that's what I had when I came in. But I love active learning and I have a bunch of different things that happen in the class. And so what I ultimately did is I got a less dense textbook. I convinced the crowds that they don't have to learn everything about psychology in the first year. They have 4 years. They can learn just the foundations. So let's get a book that does the foundations well. And I went from 6 hours of lecturing every 2 weeks to 5 hours of lecturing every 2 weeks, and an hour that's explicitly there for active learning. So I just let the students know, yes, you're going to eat some time doing these things, but that's budgeted in the classroom. So I'm literally making this trade-off of saying less content. I want to focus on the right content, and I want it to be really deep. A deep learning of that right content. And I think that involves students working with the knowledge, because that's when they really get that deep understanding of it. So let me just make that point really clear at the outset too, because I've been guilty in the past of writing things that suggest content learning or skill learning. And I should never have written it that way. It's when they do skill learning, they're almost always doing critical thinking with the content or creative thinking with the content. And so often it's deepening their learning and understanding of the content while it's exercising the skills. So I think a lot of these tasks do both. They take the content learning to a deeper level and they exercise the skills at the same time. So that's really cool. I'm seeing a few more of these go back. Yeah, glad you like the real example. Normalize the anxiety. Yeah.
Okay, Steve, only a last question, just because we passed the time that we have been allocated for, but yes, let's take the last question.
Yeah. Okay, so I was looking at Jane's here. How, as a way to reduce an area I'm really interested in is how perfectionism, the maladaptive type, impacts on the learning process. I've observed perfectionism students being especially avoidant of engaging with feedback. This could provide a solution. Yeah, I mean, it certainly could. I think so. I don't know if I have a good answer for you other than to say I agree with you. I mean, that is the tricky thing. But if someone's struggling with perfectionism, sometimes it is this resistance to having flaws in their work pointed out. And I think one of the things I've noticed with my students is just letting them know when you receive that feedback, you're not going to feel good about it. And that's normal. Just that idea that this is how I feel when I get a review. This you feel like that's your brain just doing its normal thing. And the powerful skill you're going to learn is to see that, accept it, and be able to get past it. And that's what most people can't do. And that's the skill you're going to learn. And so when they just understand they're supposed to feel that way, it makes them feel a lot better. And that's where I think the original growth mindset thing kind of missed the bus. It didn't acknowledge the villain. Cool. So we'll leave it with a villain, maybe.
Yes, and finally, Leila is saying something very interesting. We'll leave it here about actually adding another element of showing the students how tutors will have marked their draft works, which may be something, another interesting idea or a layer to add to this process. So thank you very much, everybody. Last question before we close is whether the tool Peer Scholar is available, Steve.
It's available anytime. If anyone's interested, I've got info at Peer Scholar. Let me know. It's being used in like 8 countries, 40,000 students a month. So it's out there. Yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for coming here to give this talk today. It's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting, eye-opening, and I'm definitely personally very much interested in using this approach. So I'll definitely get in touch with you. But equally, if anyone is interested, please do get in touch with Steve. Thank you, everyone, for making this effort to be here today during a busy time. And I hope you enjoyed our session. So good afternoon or good evening to everybody. I don't know what the time zones are. We're gonna be around after the end of the session until everybody goes away. So thank you. We'll stop the recording now.